So good evening, everyone. So I'll apologize in advance. I have had a long 2 or 3 days of talking nonstop. So my voice is a little cracky right now, but that's all right. Welcome to the Charlotte Museum of History. From the indigenous peoples that first called this land home, to the entrepreneurs and innovators that shaped our city into what it is today, we are proud to share the diverse and fascinating histories of the Queen City. As we delve into our collective past, we strive to remind you that every person's story is important, whether they're a famous figure in history or an everyday citizen who lived their life quietly, but with purpose. Our institution exists to explore and preserve all histories, from the heroic to the horrific, the daunting to the dazzling. We're privileged enough to do so with the support of our community. We believe the literary arts have the power to amplify unsung voices and to tell the untold realities that have been overlooked or avoided for too long. Books like Money Rock chronicle events and shed light on issues that highlight all the ways in which our society has failed our most vulnerable citizens. But it also highlights how we can collectively move forward to make the Piedmont a better place for everyone. Thank you for being here today, and let's all keep writing and reading the stories that make us who we are and inspire us to be even more. Now, I mentioned that we're able to do our work here at the museum based on the support of our community. Thankfully, we are lucky to have the support of an organization as impactful as NC Humanities. For over 50 years, they have been connecting and inspiring communities from the Appalachians to the Atlantic Shore. Now, I have to stop here because I am from Pennsylvania and we say Appalachian, and it is my natural reaction to say that, and I understand that is riot causing if I say Appalachian here. So Appalachian to the Atlantic Shore. We have here tonight Sherry Paula Watkins. She is the Executive Director of North Carolina Humanities. As an active contributor to the humanities community for over 20 years, she brings a wealth of experience and passion for innovative public humanities programming, cultural experiences, and meaningful dialogue. This year, she is celebrating her 10th year as Executive Director of the organization. And as someone just hitting my 10th month, that is definitely goals. So please join me, ladies and gentlemen, welcoming Ms. Sherry Paula Watkins to the podium, and thank you again for coming this evening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Terry, for that generous introduction and for hosting us at this beautiful museum. As Terry said, I'm Sherry Paula Watkins, and I have the pleasure of serving as North Carolina Humanities Executive Director. On behalf of our Board of Trustees and staff, I want to welcome those who are here in person and those who are joining us via live stream on YouTube to our panel discussion of Money Rock, a family story of cocaine, race, and ambition in the New South. This is the third book in our 2023 North Carolina Reads Statewide Book Club series. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available to share afterwards. This program would not be possible without our panelists joining together for this discussion. Thank you to Rick Timms, Pam Kelley, Dr. Seth Kotch, and Dr. Barbara Lash. Thank you. We are truly honored to have Belton Platt and his wife, Mashandia, here in the audience this evening. Thank you for joining us. Belton will be joining our panelists later during the question and answer portion of our program. So as you listen to this conversation, we hope you will think of questions about the book to ask the panelist and Belton. Thank you, Belton, for being here and for being part of this meaningful conversation. North Carolina Humanities started our North Carolina Reads Statewide Book Club last year during our 50th anniversary. At the heart of North Carolina Reads is our desire to connect communities through shared reading experiences, discussion, and reflection. Our Statewide Book Club brings content experts such as these, book authors, and community members together to read and to discuss 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equity and the history and culture of North Carolina. This program allows us to create spaces for talking about important, timely issues. Books and the stories within them are powerful tools. They allow us to access information and ideas. They help us to learn and to reflect, to heal and to process. And perhaps most importantly, they help us to better understand one another's stories and experiences, some of which may be familiar to us and some that are different, allowing us to see through the eyes of another person. When we put these tools to use, we are working together towards a deeper understanding and an empathy within North Carolina, which we believe is vitally important to our American democracy. Grabbing books from their local libraries and independent bookstores, readers from across the state are gathering in person and virtually to read our North Carolina Reads books and to share their perspectives. North Carolina Humanities provided community reading resources by distributing nearly 3,600 free North Carolina Reads books, discussion guides, and materials to libraries, community colleges, local book clubs, and individuals in over 100 cities across 60 counties in North Carolina. People are still reading. If you enjoy tonight's program, we encourage you to visit our website or talk with our staff about how you can support North Carolina Humanities so that next year, more resources will be available to those who need them all across North Carolina. At this time, I want to thank North Carolina Humanities affiliate partners, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress Center for the Book, as well as our event host, the Charlotte Museum of History. Terry, we are so appreciative of your support and for helping make tonight a success. And now, we're excited to have a special guest, Yara Albiari, District Liaison for the Office of Congresswoman Adams, who will read a letter from the Congresswoman. Congresswoman Adams represents North Carolina's 12th district, which largely includes the Charlotte area. Throughout her career, she has promoted quality education for all students, sponsoring and advancing numerous pieces of legislation to boost funds for historically Black colleges and universities. We know Congresswoman Adams as a strong supporter of the arts and humanities in North Carolina, the United States, and beyond. After Yara speaks, we'll have the pleasure of Rick Timms, who will begin tonight's panel discussion of Money Rock. Rick is the retired executive director of the Charlotte Observer. He's also taught journalism at the Knight School of Communication for Queen's University of Charlotte. We are fortunate to also call Rick part of our NC Humanities team for almost 6 years now, as he is currently a trustee on the board of North Carolina Humanities. Thank you again to everyone for attending, whether you're here in person or online. We hope you enjoy tonight's program. Please join me now in welcoming Yara to the stage to read a special letter from Congresswoman Adams. Yara?
Good evening. So I am Yara Albiari, and I am honored tonight to bring you greetings on behalf of Congresswoman Alma Adams, who is currently in DC voting on congressional business. The Congresswoman wanted me to let you know how honored she is that NC Humanities invited us tonight to speak on the remarks about today's discussion of Money Rock by author and journalist Pam Kelley. The book speaks to much of the work Representative Adams does in Congress because it shines a light on racial, social, and economic inequality that we face in this country and in our communities. Pam, your body of work, not only for Charlotte, but for the state of North Carolina and the region, speak for itself. You've done a remarkable job in uniting and connecting North Carolinians, sparking dialogues, and inspiring a sense of community. I hope those assembled here will join me in giving you one of many rounds of applause tonight. Supporting the arts and humanities here in North Carolina is one of the Congresswoman's core missions, and you'd expect nothing less from an art professor with 40 years of experience. In Congress, she committed to making arts and humanities more accessible to everyone in Charlotte. Since President Biden took office, Congress has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. As such, Congresswoman Adams was proud to vote for the American Rescue Plan, which allocated over $1 billion additional dollars to helping museums, libraries, theaters, concert halls, and other venues recovering from the pandemic. Congress did this because the humanities are essential in a democratic society. They're part of our very identity. That is why the work of NC Humanities, as well as that of the talented authors, content makers, and panelists participating tonight in this monthly book club event is so important. Humanities raise questions, they encourage conversation, contextualize experiences, and connect people across differences in local communities. And that's why preserving our humanities and our culture, our cultural heritage is so crucial. And it's why the reporting and storytelling in Money Rock is so significant, and why the discussion we're having here tonight is also impactful as well. To the audience, I'm thankful you're here today to join this conversation, and once you leave here tonight, we hope you'll start discussions of your own with your loved ones and people in your lives to spread knowledge and spark enlightenment throughout your communities. As we prepare for the discussion tonight, the Congresswoman wanted me to share one of her favorite quotes. "A society can only grow when old men and women plant trees in whose shade they will never sit." It is my hope that your work will continue to sow these seeds for years to come, and that we will continue to open worlds of knowledge and imagination for students of all ages, and push back against a climate of censorship and that wants to avoid difficult dialogues. With that, NC Humanities, Pam, Kelley, esteemed panelists, thank you for your service to our community and our culture, and here's to many more impactful discussions. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and it's great to be here. As you heard, I am Rick Timms, and it's very nice to be here at the Charlotte Museum of History, and also to be here to have an opportunity to talk about a really interesting book. So I will be able to pull these out. First of all, I would like to introduce our panelists, and starting with the author of Money Rock, that's Pam Kelley. Pam is a former reporter with the Charlotte Observer. Pam has won numerous journalism awards, including honors from the National Press Club and the Society for Features Journalism. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, Bloomberg City Lab, and the Assembly, where she recently co-authored How to Sell a University, a story about the remaking of High Point University. We also have with us Dr. Seth Kotch, a professor of history at the University of North Carolina. Seth's research interests include modern American history, specifically the social history of criminal justice. His book, Lethal State, was published by UNC Press in 2019. In it, he explores the history of the death penalty in North Carolina. Seth also directs the Southern Oral History Program. And finally, we are pleased to have with us Dr. Barbara Pinson Lash. Barbara has 20 years of experience as a TV broadcast journalist and a public speaker. She serves as a media, public speaking, and branding coach. In 2007, Barbara established Mediaverse Communications and authored a book. It's called Athletes and the Media Bridging the Gap. Recently, she completed her PhD, congratulations, and is now on as an adjunct professor at the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So let's get started with our questions for tonight. And this first question is for Pam. Pam, tell us what initially led you to report on Belton Lamont Platte, and later, what led you to revisit his life for this book?
Well, I'll actually start with the revisiting. And it was a question. My daughter, who was a teenager at the time, had asked for Christmas for Jay-Z's Decoded. Story of his life and his music, and in it, he tells the story of growing up as a crack dealer in the Bronx, and or in Brooklyn, I'm sorry. And when I read it, it reminded me of a story I had done long ago. I think this was around 2011. A story I had done in the 80s when I was a young reporter covering courts. It reminded me of this drug dealer named Money Rock. I mean, what Jay-Z was describing, the public housing, the drug dealing in public housing, the single moms, the drug dealers trying to support their families, like it sounded exactly the same. And so I had this question, it's like, I wonder whatever happened to Money Rock. And I went to one of our able researchers and said, do you think maybe you could find this guy? And he had recently gotten out of federal prison, and she found a number for him, and I called him. And he said, I remember you, because I had covered his trial, and I'd actually interviewed him in Central Prison after he was convicted of a shooting in Piedmont courts. He said, you know, I've been wanting somebody to tell my story. So that's how it started. And it started as a series for the Charlotte Observer.
And then went on to be the book.
And then went on to be the book, yeah.
And Seth and Barbara, I'd like to ask you, first of all, were you familiar with this story before you saw the book? And secondly, what is it about the book that you found insightful or surprising?
I was not familiar with it. I'm not a native Charlottean. I moved here in '07 and then again in 2014 to work in the news. But what I loved about it is the connection I felt with it, because even in my PhD program at UNC Charlotte, I spent a number of years within the Hidden Valley community and got to really understand the narrative compared to the lived experience, and was able to even do a documentary, co-create a documentary with residents there. So that was one connection. And the other is that I was working in news when Keith Lamont Scott was shot. So when you introduced that toward the end of the book, I just felt like that. It took me right back to the news desk, the anchor desk, and the pull and tug of our city just being in the throes of just unsettled. We were so unsettled at that point, and so those are my connections to the book.
Thank you. And Seth, were you familiar with the book? I mean, the story, I should say, before you saw the book?
Well, I mean, of course, I'm a child of the 90s. I grew up listening to Mobb Deep and Snoop Dogg and Wu-Tang Clan, and so the story of the cocaine trade, the story of poverty, the story of crime and the glamorous attraction of crime and what crime could buy you. This was something that I thought I knew very well growing up in Chapel Hill in the suburbs, aspiring to the lifestyle that all of us we were drinking from a fire hose, with music videos, news reporting, music, television. Boys from the Hood is winning Oscars. We're watching Dead Presidents every weekend on our sleepover. So in one sense, this was deeply familiar to me. Of course, in the actual lived experience sense, no. I had the huge advantage of not being born into a place that had been very deliberately reduced into a space of struggle and poverty that created what I think Pam calls an economy of poverty, an alternate economy created by people who needed a way to survive, but had been excluded from the traditional economy, and that, of course, is the drug economy.
So that part was new to you, the part about the drug economy and how that happened.
Well, I mean, this individual story was of course very new to me, right? So I mean, what's so resonant about it is the individual details and the people involved, and your mother, Belton, being so connected to movements in Charlotte to improve the lives of people there. I learned a lot about Charlotte from this. I was delighted to see Tom Hanchett's work in there, and Pam Grundy, of course. But to see this told on an individual and a family level and a generational level, that was all new to me, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Next question, why do you think it is important to understand Belton's life in the context of the development of Charlotte and in the larger context of some major themes that we see in the book? And I'll just name a few. The civil rights movement, urban renewal, redlining, segregation, and the so-called war on drugs. Why do you think that is important to understand in Belton's life in the context of development of Charlotte?
So, when I covered Belton's trial and wrote about it, so he was involved in a shootout with another guy named Big Lou in Piedmont courts. And I actually covered both their trials. They had two different ones. And then I wrote a big Sunday story that I was, pretty proud of, called Money Rock and Big Lou, Portrait of a Shootout. Ran on the front page. And when I look back at it now, I'm embarrassed, really. It was about all the money and the bling and the jewelry and the cars, and there was no context. There was none of the things that you just talked about, right? And unfortunately, with journalism, that's often the case. You get this kind of surface story without the historical context. And I feel really fortunate that, because you don't usually get do-overs in journalism, like, let me go back and tell that story again. And this time, let's look at all those things. And I had a lot more time, thanks to my editors at The Observer, and I was able to ask questions that I never thought about the first time, looking at Piedmont courts. Like, we knew it was it's considered the most dangerous place in Charlotte, this kind of outdoor, drive-through drug and cocaine. It was really known for cocaine, and there were shootings. But just ask the most obvious question: why is this place here, this place of poverty and struggle on the edge of downtown in this kind of booming city, and why is everybody there black? And it's so obvious you don't even, it's like the water you swim in, you don't realize it's there. And so once I started asking that question, that's when you look at urban renewal, you look at segregation, and really it goes all the way back to slavery. So, it's important because we really can't understand our present unless we understand the past.
Right. And Seth and Barbara, did either of you, were you familiar with this piece of Charlotte history? Did you understand what had happened in Charlotte during these years of redlining or maybe more broadly in society? Did you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know that I was familiar with this story from a Charlotte perspective. I think it's remarkable that you can ask a question about redlining and urban renewal, and we all sort of know what that is now, right? The people who were living through these things knew what they were, but in terms of the broader public conversation, I didn't know what redlining is until, fairly recently. I didn't know that urban renewal was a code name for running highways through black communities and knocking down homes of black residents and not giving them access to affordable homes elsewhere. So I think that it's revelatory for me that these sort of code words have been revealed to the point where we can be comfortable with the shared definition of what these things mean. Of course, the question is then what do we do with that shared knowledge, right? But I do think that there has been a sea change in how a broader public understands what these stories are, and how a broader public hopefully can see the water that they're swimming in. We start to notice that we're a little wet, right? Because when we read books like yours and when we have discussions in spaces like this, we notice that we're underwater, and we notice the sort of whatever the metaphor is. We notice the stream that's flowing into that space that's making us wet. And that stream is a history that goes back to enslavement and flows right through the post-enslavement period and into the developments of the early 20th century and starts to build itself into something that's, you know, a rushing river by the time we enter the 1960s and the 1970s, and black communities that in the 50s and 60s had shown that they understood their own value as citizens, that they understood the value of home ownership, of artistic expression, of economic independence, that demonstrating the understanding of that value led to a ferocious response. And we see the response in Pam's story, and the response is quite literally the physical and also emotional destruction of communities that were giving these black residents an opportunity to participate in the civil and economic life of this community in the city.
Barbara, would you like to add to that?
Yes, please, thank you. I think it really adds to, when we talk about the context and these defined moments, we can centrally say we understand these things now. But the biggest thing for me is that I hope that it increases the capacity for people to push past judgment, right? Especially for those who have several degrees of separation from their experience, perhaps in an affluent neighborhood, an affluent white neighborhood, versus a Piedmont courts, right? Where it could be easy to say, oh, well, you know, Belton just made a bunch of bad decisions and he could have done different. His mom was an advocate, you know, she was a positive role model. So he just, you know, it's his fault versus, well, guess what? It wasn't just his fault. If we're going to talk about that, then what were the decisions he had to choose from, right? Someone in an affluent neighborhood may have a choice between, I'm going to go buy drugs and use drugs, or I'm going to go to class, or I'm going to sell drugs, or I'm going to go work at my uncle's law firm, or I'm going to intern at my mom's job. What were the decisions that the people growing up in Piedmont courts had to choose from? And I think that's what the context does. It helps us pull back those layers to say, oh, wow, there's so much more to this. And in many ways, people are reacting to their environment. As much as we're making decisions, it's reaction in many ways. So I think that's the beauty of interweaving these stories, juxtapose what's happening, the decision of the banking industry, the real estate industry, the government making these decisions to create these pockets of concentrated poverty. So I'm hoping that that builds the capacity, because in many ways, there are so many of these neighborhoods still relevant today. There are kids growing up in very similar environments. So for some, it has changed, but we're still looking at the same things. And I think we need to have that capacity to understand a little bit more.
Right, thank you. And there are kids growing up still in these conditions. Are there still kids growing up who have no idea of what this is about? You both teach students. I wonder if you find, do you see more understanding among those students?
I would say in my experience, I do see more understanding, and I see the light bulb goes on a little quicker, and the conversations go a little bit longer. It also creates a little bit more of a debate in some of my classes, where it's like, well, this is how I feel, well, this is how it is, well, this is how you think it is. But just the fact that the debates are grander, I think is something positive. And I think that we are now more comfortable talking about these different things. I think it really does help in the greater context of at least making us more aware, because those students will then hopefully go on to be in decision-making positions, and they'll have context that maybe some of the folks who were deciding that, oh yeah, we're not going to approve loans for people in this community, maybe they didn't have that context, or maybe they did and that was exactly the plan. But nonetheless, I feel like we've kind of opened things up a little bit, at least within the classes that I've had, to have those healthy discussions. Because I always tell them, you're going to go on to make some decisions one day. You need to know why you're making that decision and where it's coming from.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, I think the students that I encounter are a little more primed for these discussions. They're still babies. You know, they're 18, 19 years old. They've had, you know, they've dipped their toes in the water, so they're ready a little bit. But a lot of them are coming from, so, you know, at UNC Chapel Hill, 85% of our students are from North Carolina, so we get, you know, a huge swath of students from all different kinds of experiences. Some of them are coming from schools where they've done deep dives on economic inequality. Some of them are coming from schools where the book on that's been banned, right? And so people have different contexts that they're bringing to the circumstance. And I think, you know, and I'm just really agreeing with Dr. Lash here. the pump has been primed, but it's all of our responsibilities to educate students, because a lot of young people are coming from a context about racism or racially disparate outcomes are about individuals who are racist. And yeah, that's sometimes true. The big picture that is a little bit less visible to people in their day-to-day is the people who have not experienced a Klan member throwing a brick through their window or someone insulting them or calling them a racial epithet, but have grown up in a context that's been created by these structures, by redlining, by urban renewal, by residential and school segregation and how they feed into one another. And I do find that some of the more rewarding moments that I've had as a teacher is drawing attention to those systems. And what this book does is it moves between Belton's story as a person experiencing the outcome of those systems, right? It's personalizing it in a meaningful way. So it plugs into people's idea about, yes, racism and racially disparate outcomes are about people. But then it puts it in the context of these systems, where a whole bunch of people who have never said a racist word in their lives can create a system that demolishes a black neighborhood. And then they can go home at the end of the day and say, yeah, I cleaned up that neighborhood. So I think talking to students, particularly young students who have that very personal sense about what racism is really helpful. And I think this interweaving is a really productive part of that conversation.
Yeah. And Pam, have you had any experiences where your book has been even banned, or anybody not wanting to use your book or anything like that? Because I see it as a good book for classrooms.
Let's get it banned. It'll
Yeah,
sell.
I was going to say, I
It would be
hope,
very
I mean,
popular.
please,
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
ban it. No, I haven't heard that. And
But
I,
it could be a popular
and I
thing.
don't know that it's being used in schools. I mean, I think it would be a good book to be used in schools, but I don't know.
I agree, yeah. So let's turn to some of these factors again that we've been touching on. And I'm curious to know what you found in Belton's life experiences that related to the experience he had in the prison system. Thinking about the time that he spent there, how he got there, what happened to him. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, the interesting thing about researching this is that there's just so many things that happened to him that correlated with these big issues. And I mean, his story, much of it really tragic, but could explain so many issues, especially when it comes to the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. And for people who've read my book, there's a chapter in there on Shirley Fulton, the woman who prosecuted Belton and got a conviction for the shooting in Piedmont courts. Shirley was a real trailblazer. She died recently, but she became a judge, the first black woman, I think the first black woman Superior Court judge in or senior Superior Court judge in North Carolina. Anyway, she was amazing. And so she started out as a prosecutor, and as she became a judge, and she kind of saw what was happening, that she was just sending these black men to prison. Just, she was presiding over a court where every day there was a new room full of black men, and she said to me, sometimes I wondered, are we going to run out of black men? And she helped make some reforms in the Mecklenburg court system that I think were really cutting edge. But back to your question about, so I used her to kind of talk about the criminal justice system and the kind of systemic racism baked into it. But, Belton was not convicted of crack cocaine. If he were, he might still be in prison. But he was convicted. He got like 24 years, and under federal law, you have to serve 85%. So he served over 20 years. And, I think like by year 1 or 2, I mean, he was a model inmate. He never had an infraction. He became a minister. He counseled other prisoners. The prison officials relied on this guy in the prisons he was in. And, you know, under the system, there was no way for him to get out a day earlier, you know, and that's a good example of kind of, I think, one of the failures of our system. And I could go on and talk about more involving his sons, but if you've read the book, you know, all of his sons ended up being convicted of felonies as well. So they had experience in the system. One son was, you know, convicted at 16. We were one of the last states in the nation to treat 16-year-olds as adults. Most states, it was 18. It's finally changed. But, so just a lot of things like that.
Right. And Seth, you study the criminal justice system. You have any thoughts on that and what you got from the book?
Well, I mean, I do have to try to mention a little bit of the history. I'll try not to go into like a full 50-minute lecture here, but, you know, North Carolina didn't have a prison until after the Civil War. And we tried twice, and I'm saying we, white male property owners who could vote at the time, voted down the idea of building a prison twice by referenda. And that was because, as I read in a letter to the editor from the 1840s maybe, that a white man wrote into a newspaper and he said, you know, you're proposing building a prison, who would you put there? White people? White men can't be slaves. That doesn't compute for me, because for him, everyone who they should be locking up was already locked up as an enslaved person. So the 1868 Constitution in North Carolina establishes a prison as like a northeastern top-down reform, because we were looking to Europe and saying, oh, this is our big progressive moment, because prisons will train people to work and to love God and to repent. The first thing those initial inmates did was build their own cells in Raleigh. Then they got immediately rented out to the railroad. And they built to the Western Carolina Railroad, they built the railroad between, you know, Asheville and Wilmington or wherever it was. And that took them 20 years. So they didn't finish building the prison until the 1880s. And so you see right away the intention of the prison. Meanwhile, around the South, southern states are passing laws that are directly based on stereotypes about black people. And these are also stereotypes about poverty. And so these are what we call pig laws. So one of the most meaningful things a man can do in this context, in the late 1800s, 19th century, is to provide for his family. And if you're poor because you have been denied an education, you've been denied the opportunity to own land, you've been denied the opportunity to own your own business, you need to feed your family, that doesn't change. What do? You steal a pig. So pig laws make the theft of livestock, move it from misdemeanor to felony, and they take your vote when you commit a felony. And there are, in December of 1865, after the surrender of the Confederacy, right, which lost the war between the states, there are black men being whipped in the courthouse in Raleigh, because if you whip someone, it confers infamy, which is a legal status that removes your vote. So there's a very tight connection between the end of enslavement and the invention of a prison system.
Which was continued enslavement, really. Yeah.
Well, absolutely, and in some ways it's less true now, because the work is less an instrumental part of what prisons are about now. But the creation of prisons in the South was about finding a mechanism in North Carolina for 350,000 formerly enslaved people to go back to work. And they said it out loud. I tell my students, I'm not like, yes, I am a socialist college professor trying to indoctrinate you, but also, the people at the time said this, right? They said, I'm a white supremacist and I'm proud of it. They said, black people are more prone to criminality. They said, they require prison to channel their labor back into the economy. And they did it deliberately, and they did it openly, and they did it without much shame, at least until the 1950s and 60s.
Barbara?
So the incarceration piece of the book and your story was probably the most heartbreaking, and that it had generational impact, because to think that most of the people within the prison system look like me and may come out in the first place when you first came out, and still not have the opportunities within your community that other communities have, you're still left with those same initial decisions. Do I do this or I do that? And so I think, you know, the prison system, it's a business. They have beds they need to fill. The laws are slow to change the makeup of the people who are occupying those beds. So I know I'm jumping around here, but I guess I just don't want to get emotional, but that is like the crux of where I am right now. To think that my son, driving down the street, you know, middle of the night going home from a party, could be from there to here in like a split second. For a number of reasons, a number of ways the laws are written, and it's just, you know, it's heartbreaking. Yes. And it's heartbreaking that, again, those choices really haven't expanded for many, you know? And I was rooting for you when you got out the first time, and I'm like, yes, he went back to his business, but then it's like you said, to support your family, to support your children, what are these decisions that you have?
What choices do you have?
What choices do you have?
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So Belton's Platt's journey to this point in his life is such a compelling story. It's an inspiring story, and we'll hear more about this. But are there also lessons here about everyone's role in creating a more just and inclusive society? What can we draw from this experience?
I mean, I would say yes. And I think, you know, I believe part of our role as good citizens is to inform ourselves and to understand the past, so we can better understand what's going on now. I'll just leave it at that.
What more can we do, or what else, what would you suggest?
I think, like, we all have biases, right? We live in this space. We grow up with our own experiences. We have our own beliefs. But, you know, if you can actually put yourself in someone else's shoes, which I think this book allowed us to do, and say, okay, well, if I had these choices, would I have made the same choices? If I looked like Belton, would I have made the same choices? If I lived in Piedmont Courts, would I have made the same choices? Or am I approaching this, oh, well, you know, I live in suburban, like we live in the Davis Lake area, you know, so would I make these? I don't know. Like, I can honestly say that I don't know what it's like to grow up in Piedmont Courts. So I acknowledge that. Like, and I think the more we do that and push ourselves beyond what we think or what our framework is that we're working with, and like try and put ourselves in someone else's shoes by reading books, by talking to people, by having dialogue, by actually saying, that might actually be a little bit of a different scenario, then I think at least we can open ourselves up to thinking more broadly and being a little more inclusive. So I work with a lot of NFL teams when it comes to unconscious bias, and that's one of the things that we talk about. You and I may play alongside each other, but I don't know you beyond this experience within this, you know, locker room or on the field, unless, hey, let's hang out. And now I'm spending time with you, and I get to see not just what I think you're doing and living and what you think is important, but I get to experience that with you. Whether or not I agree, at least I understand from a different context because I'm in it with you. So I think we have to, like, you're not going to be more inclusive sitting in your living room.
Right. So get to know people and get to be in their shoes.
And it may take a little more work than that, but at least start there.
Right, good. And Seth, you study the criminal justice system and probably have looked at any number of experiments in the world. What came to mind for you as you read through this book?
Well, I mean, I'll just mention, and I can't really speak as a historian here. I'm paid to talk about the past, not about the future. But it's clear to me that that Belton should not have been in a position where he had to change his own life despite being in prison. not as a benefit of being in prison, but despite the conditions of imprisonment. And I've only spent a little bit of time in Central Prison, but I would not want to spend the amount of time that he spent there. That we briefly during COVID, and again, I'm just speaking as an individual here, we had a brief experiment with the idea that if the government can meaningfully invest in people's lives, it can increase their access to education, their access to healthcare, their access to nutritious food, their access to healthy lives in supportive structures. And we know what it takes to do that kind of work. It takes meaningful investment in the lives of children, in our communities, and it takes things that are as simple as planting more trees in neighborhoods and as potentially complicated, but honestly kind of simple, as feeding kindergartners in their classrooms. So there are pathways, compassionate pathways that in a different space we would be able to agree that the burden for making yourself a complete person should be shared among all the members of your community, and that sharing cannot happen if that community is under constant assault from the very government that is supposed to be vouchsafing that community's health and turning the members of that community against one another. Prison has always been imagined as a solution to the kinds of problems that we read about in Belton's narrative, to poverty, to hunger, to desperation. And for generations and generations, it's always been, well, how can we make the prison work a little bit better? But we're not going back to those root causes. We're not saying, well, wait a second, maybe prison isn't actually the solution to these problems. And maybe the solution is one where we joyfully invest in communities. And let's deal with the health of those communities. And that opens pathways to then dealing with segregation, then dealing with inequity in schools, and then dealing with these other problems. And it's been a tragedy, not only to learn about this particular story, but also to think about the things that we are grasping towards that are within our reach, but seem designed to be pulled away.
Can I just add one quick
Sure,
thing
yeah.
also? You had me think about something. It's the other thing that I would love for people to do, and I think we can be more inclusive, is to not stop, right? We just came out of, 2 years of advocacy for Black Lives Matter, for, just trying to implement or undo some of the systemic things that have caused us to create these concentrated areas of poverty, for example. There was like this huge wave of energy of like, let's make not just our community, let's make the lives of everyone better. I'm gonna understand what you're doing. This system isn't working, let's do something about it. On our jobs, we had all these affinity groups and people were talking and learning. And it just seems like that has just gone away now. Like life seems to be going back to not only where it was for some, but even farther back. There seems to be, I don't know about you ladies and gentlemen, but I feel like this energy of just, like people are mean. I mean, really. Anywhere you go, it's just, we're so quick to anger, and there's like this sense of just, people are on edge, and it's like sometimes the worst parts of ourselves are just showing up so quickly and being inflamed by the thought, I might bump into you in the store. That doesn't need to turn into a thing. I just bumped into you. And so whatever was happening a couple years ago where we were all locked in arms and fighting for each other and trying to understand and being advocates, gosh, I wish we could just pull a little bit of that back into the framework so that we can not only advocate for each other, but these decisions that have been made that have destroyed any chance of generational wealth in the Black communities can start to be undone. Mm-hmm. The housing rates, the affordable housing in this area, it's unfathomable what it costs to live in the Charlotte area right now, right? We're constantly, oh yeah, we're gonna declare eminent domain and just take over and, like you mentioned earlier, destroy an entire historically Black community. And then, oh yeah, well, good luck.
Yeah. Well, I think we need more people to read this book, don't you? Yeah, and so we need to get it banned. What do you think? So let's all work hard on that, right? But seriously, if more people did read this book, they would have a better understanding of what people are facing, right? So let's hear it for that. And I'd like to take it back to each of you just for a second, and before we take questions from the audience. But each of you is a published author, and you're all involved very much in work, and I'm just curious to know, is there anything that you're working on now, if there is, that you could share with us? We'd like to hear about it if there is.
I've been doing some articles for The Assembly, which is an online long-form magazine that focuses on North Carolina. So if you're not familiar with it, check it out. It's really good. And it does a lot of investigative work and looks at kind of a lot of the issues that we've been discussing here tonight. I've got a longer term idea for a book that I'd like to do. I'm probably not ready to talk about yet, but I will say that it, like this story, it's narrative nonfiction, and it combines a modern story and history. It brings history to a modern story.
So we'll look forward to that. Seth,
It'll
anything
be
you'd
a
like
while.
to share?
Yeah, I don't know if I say it out loud, does it mean I'll do it?
Yes.
Or am I cursing myself?
You're on the record.
I'm just starting working on a book I'm calling King Jim, and it's a history of the criminal justice system in the Jim Crow South. Chunky book, one chapter per institution. Courts, police, sheriffs, 3 more. Feel free to throw me some ideas. I'm starting June 1, once teaching is over. So I'm looking forward to the project, and I'm gonna be here 3.5 years from now,
Yes.
let's say, maybe. Okay, I'll be back, yeah.
Very good, very good. Yes.
All right, so
Barbara?
it is said, so it is done, or will be done. I'm working to bring my PhD work to a broader audience and hopefully into a TED Talk. I interviewed 30 NFL players, current and former, who self-identify as coming from humble beginnings, to talk about that narrative and how we are taught to believe it's all the same for everyone, but in reality it's not. And when I asked them, for example, what you'd like me to do with this information, they said share it so that people understand what it means to be a total athlete. And this whole idea of fixating place and space to them, that every black NFL player has to come, is one mistake away from, going back to a community like Piedmont Courts, where their only options are drug dealing or professional sports. So to just dismantle that narrative a little bit in the form of perhaps the TED Talk. So I'm saying it now, so
Okay.
give me 5 years though. Okay.
All right, we've heard you. Okay, good. Well, thank you, panelists, for this good discussion, and this is great conversation. So, at this time, I would like you all to join me in welcoming Belton Platt to join our panelists.
Hey, Belton.
We have time for a few audience questions, so if you have a question for Belton or our panelists, please raise your hand, and a staff member will bring you a microphone. Who has a question?
Question, please raise your hand.
Don't
and
be
I'm happy
bashful.
to bring over a microphone for you.
Hello. I really enjoyed your talk today. So we didn't talk much about the millions of black men and women who are stopped, pulled over, arrested, matriculated through the penal system simply because they were walking while black, or driving while black, or just sitting while black. How do we as black people avoid a scenario like that? And there's just so many innocent, 100% innocent African American people in prison.
Who would like to speak to that?
I have a friend who wrote a book, How Not to Get Killed by the Police. And he's a former FBI agent who was actually profiled after leaving a sting with the head of the FBI in his area. And he was profiled, stuck in a car, down on the sidewalk for hours because they just wouldn't simply reach into his pocket and get his badge. So he wrote this book to really talk about really just how to make it home safely, or make it to the jail safely so that you can live to fight another day. So that's like I mentioned earlier, my son, that's a very real concern. Even when I used to go to work at 2:30 in the morning, my husband and I had a plan. If I see lights behind me, I'm going to put my blinkers on and I'm going to drive to the most well-lit. And we actually mapped out locations on every exit from our house to the Fox station I was working at, just because of this, right? So I think the more that people hear that we are making real decisions on a daily basis to plot a way to get home alive based on an interaction with police officers because of the fear, I think that's one thing. And then it's also to understand that not all police are ones who would inflict harm on people. The balance, I think, really has to go back to where we were, like I said, when we were marching arm in arm just a year and a half ago. Like, we've got to keep having, we have to have advocates in all spaces. So while we're trying to undo some of the woes of the past and even of current administrations, we can still understand that we've got advocates, and there are more eyes on this situation than just me trying to protect my son.
And Belton, you've worked with a lot of young people since you've been back in Charlotte and the area. What would you say to that? How would you answer that question?
Educating the youth, educating people. This book that she just mentioned, people need to know what to do, you know, how to conduct themselves. One of the things that I try to talk to youth about is their legal rights and responsibilities, and having knowledge of the law. You see, I believe education is important. I believe in teaching them what to do if they are pulled over, how to conduct themselves, you know, how to act, what their rights are. And I believe when people are more informed, they can make more informed decisions.
Thank you. And Seth, are we making progress in working with the police to deal with this, these built-in biases that we're seeing? Is there any progress in North Carolina that you're aware of? Anything?
I mean, I could really only answer just as a citizen who occasionally reads the news. I mean, I will say that historically, these kinds of relationships have been deeply problematic, and the race of the police officer and the race of the person who they're encountering does not appear to have a meaningful effect on that relationship. And there's a piece that was written in the 1950s about some of the first black policemen in Southern police forces when they were desegregating. And what that research found was that black communities, and we don't want to speak about black communities like they're all the same, right? But this took like a group of different African-American communities in places like Memphis, and I forget the other cities, maybe Atlanta, and representatives of those communities had asked for black policemen to be hired onto their forces because they felt they were being ignored by the white police force. So this is the other side of that coin, right? Is that you shouldn't have to choose between brutality and neglect. But they felt like they were being neglected. So they started hiring black officers, and those black officers quickly gained a reputation as being particularly brutal and intrusive. And the explanation that was given was that those black officers, in order to make their way through an almost entirely white police force, had to demonstrate to the white police leadership that they were willing to crack down on, quote, their own people. And so those black community representatives then went back to the town leadership and were like, actually, we don't want this. This isn't what we asked for. We thought we would get a more community-oriented style of policing from these officers who come from our community. And so it was this sort of devil's bargain. You know, you asked for more police because they wanted help keeping their community safe, and what they got was brutality. Then you ask for less police, and you get back in the original situation that you're in the first place. So just as a citizen, I'm not sure that we can get there through training. I'm not sure that we can get there when we have militarized police forces who have untrammeled power to harm and to kill people. It scares me, and it doesn't scare me in the same way as my African-American brothers and sisters and friends. I don't have those fears for my sons, but I can identify that that's different than some people whose experiences I've had the privilege to learn about. But I think it's a big, big issue that will take a lot of courage and a lot of structural change to address.
And a lot of community support.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions for our panelists or for Belton from the audience this evening? Okay.
I'm a counselor in the East Charlotte over here. I've been here in Charlotte for about a year. And I work with a lot of kids that are in group home systems or have come from very, low income, very tragic, not a chance for real schooling, education, anything like that. They all seem to be about between 12 and 15. And the thing is alarming to me, they see no hope for the future. There's no hope. Like, I've been trying to work with them one-on-one about, what's your plan for the future? Do you see the importance of school? When they're not even being schooled, they're in alternative placements and day treatment programs where they don't, they don't learn math, they don't learn how to read. They're basically just contained there, from what I can tell. What can I tell them that, not to lose hope? In the year that I've been here, I'm running out of, how to motivate them, how to encourage them. But of course I keep doing it. But if you have any, Belton, if you have any words, they don't come from families that gave them life skills. So when you don't learn life skills, you learn survival skills. And that's deeply entrenched in them. So I was wondering if you had any advice that I could share with them.
One day we were in one of our programs and the question was asked, how many of you have experienced a close loved one, someone you loved, someone you cared about, experience a death of a loved one? I looked around, we probably had, 40 kids? Maybe about 40 kids. And almost all of them raised their hands. When I looked at that, I was shocked. I was literally shocked. But I realized one thing that I did not understand when I was younger. I believe those who have read this book, I think they ought to realize that there's a lot of Beltons out there. There's a lot of hurting kids out there, a lot of Beltons. And when I think about the book and I think about that, that's what I think, because I'm dealing with Beltons every single day who watched his mother get stabbed by his father and wanting to help his mother, but it was his dad trying to murder her. That traumatic experience there, it devastated a 5-year-old boy's life. What I learned from all of those kids that raised their hands was that they all were grieving. They were grieving. As adults, we know how to sort of get through the grief periods. And most of the time we talk about grief, we're thinking about a loved one who have gone on to be, to the other side, be with the Lord or whatever. But when a father walks out of the house, that's a loss for a child. A mother and father breaks, that's a loss. All of these things that have affected the homes, the communities that we're talking about today, it's a generation of children who are grieving. As a young child, I didn't know what this was, the hurt, the pain, what I was going through. My teachers and different people in the community, they just thought, oh, he has a quick temper, he's a fighter, he's this. But what they didn't realize was I was hurting on the inside. I'm saying this for a reason, ma'am. I was hurting, but did not understand, first of all, that I was hurting, and neither did I understand how to deal with it. And there was no one around me to address the hurt because they didn't have knowledge as to how to identify what was going on with this kid and the generation of kids that was coming up in Dalton Village, Piedmont Court. We experienced so much trauma before we go to the first grade. You see, and we're hurt, we're wounded. There's nothing from the first grade up to the 12th grade to deal. You teach us math, you teach us social studies, you teach us history, you teach us science, you teach us all these things, but there's nothing in place to address the grief, the hurt, the pain, the anger that we're going through, and this world that we come out of and go into another world that we're not comfortable with, neither do we understand anything about it. We only understand our world. And there's nothing there to help us understand our world, so to speak, how to get out of it, how to get through it. And then once we get to the other side, no one understands that we come from another world. And this hurt, this pain, these traumatic experiences, this grief, this sorrow, this anger, no one addresses it. So those kids that you're actually mentoring, counseling, the one thing I can say to you is don't give up on them. Don't throw them away. Don't get tired of them. I feel love, it conquers all things. And when a child knows that you truly love them and you care about them, and maybe this will help you. Maybe if you try to address some of the trauma, the hurt that they're actually going through, and they can trust you, and the way to build that is just loving them, just listening to them, just being there for them. And then that will establish some type of relationship where eventually they may trust you to share with you these deep things, these deep-seated things that they're grieving over, they're hurting over, they're struggling with, and causing some of the mental issues that we have to deal with when counseling these youths. Yes.
Something that I've seen work with someone who I know who works with children quite a bit as a teacher. She actually has more of a coaching mindset, but if you don't already, maybe give them some type of tool that they can use even within their own home. So meditation, thankfully, is becoming a very broadly used thing. When you look at LeBron James, who now has a whole thing on the Calm app, it's becoming very acceptable. That's beautiful. Yeah, because Pam talked about that in the book, how the stress levels creates like this crazy cortisone level, and it creates damage over time. So it's beautiful that you, like you said, are building trust with them just by being there, and then to give them a tangible tool that if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and something's going on, they can just, okay, I'm just going to breathe. You know what I mean? Like, I think that those are great places to ground them for the space and time that you have to work with them.
Do we have a question down here?
Yes, Rick, I think we've got time for one more
Yeah, here we
question.
are.
So I see a question up here. I'll hold this for you.
Yes, I'd like to know, how is the judicial system changing to address some of these sensitive issues? You said one time, are we looking at 18 now instead of 16? Things like that. Is it doing anything better now?
Thank you.
Pam, you want to speak to that?
Slowly, but that yeah, that's one thing that has changed in North Carolina. And, you know, under President Obama, you know, if you dealt crack, the penalties were a lot stiffer than cocaine. I mean, they're the same drug. So they changed that somewhat. I don't know that it's totally the same. In North Carolina, they've also dialed back. I mean, one of the really most horrific things that I wrote about was Belton's oldest son was in solitary confinement for a total of like a couple years. And there have been some changes, and I think some improvements there. It's just barbaric. I mean, considered by, you know, like the Geneva Convention to be torture, and that's what we've been doing in North Carolina. So change is slow. I mean, the other thing is, I think nobody wants to build any more prisons now, so that's good. The prison population has declined some. We're still the most highly incarcerated, you know, first world country by far. So very small steps.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Melissa, you want to come up?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Melissa Giblin. I'm director of North Carolina Center for the Book at North Carolina Humanities. I want to say a special thank you to Pam, to Seth, Barbara, Rick, and Belton for your great conversation tonight. This was such a great way to celebrate our North Carolina Reads program and the power of reading, books, and community with you. Please give our panelists and moderator a round of applause. And to you in the audience, both here at the museum and watching virtually, I appreciate your presence and for participating in our North Carolina Reads program. You are why we are here. We invite everyone to visit our website at www.nchumanities.org, where you can download our North Carolina Reads reading schedule and discussion guide for free, watch any of our past programs on our YouTube channel, and share your feedback about this event. Let us hear from you. We learn from your input and experience. Thank you again for being part of our North Carolina Humanities community, and we hope to see you at our next North Carolina Reads discussion, where we will be talking about Under a Gilded Moon online on May 23rd. Thank you, and please keep reading.